Right, so today's online presentation focuses on the politics of British Columbia, featuring some insights from Dr. Tracy Summerville. Dr. Summerville is an associate professor of political science at UNBC. Her research includes work on sustainable communities and a study on the impacts of globalization on northern British Columbia. Dr. Summerville loves to be in the classroom and virtually into our classroom, and she believes deeply in empowering students to take ownership of their learning. She was the recipient of the UNBC Teaching Award in 2000 and was shortlisted for the Canadian Political Science Prize for Teaching Excellence in 2010. In 2013, she was the recipient of UNBC Advancement of Literacy Award and the UNBC Excellence in Teaching Award. So thank you very much, Tracy, for taking time to visit us virtually and talk a little bit about provincial politics in British Columbia. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, you're welcome. And I actually wish I was in the classroom. Certainly not my style to sit and talk. So I'm going to keep, I hope, my comments to about 20 minutes, which is what I was asked to do. And then open it up, hopefully, for some discussion and get to know you a little bit better. So I just want to tell you a bit about myself, other than that very kind introduction. I grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. So if you don't know where that is, it's just a suburb of Toronto. And I went to school at the University of Western Ontario. I did my BA and my MA there, and that's in London. And then I did my PhD at Université Laval in Quebec. And I came out to BC in 1996. I initially came out to this university just for a short contract, and I fell in love with this great city. It's a super place to live, and I stayed here. So I've been at UNBC since 1996. And one of the first things that I realized coming out here was really how the politics was pretty unique, and it was very funny when I first started and was trying to really get to know BC politics. I'd just come from Quebec. I'd actually, as you guessed, from 1996, I'd just come out of the whole major sovereignty debate, the referendum. I'd lived through that there. And I had thought I had seen polarized politics, but when I came out here, I really realized that the polarization was quite different. So I hope today I can kind of give you a bit of a sense of what I've learned as I've both lived here, been a political observer, been a participant in the politics out here, and got a kind of sense of the politics of British Columbia. And I think for me, one of the things that's really critical, and here I will just show you this map that of BC, because the more I live here and the more I study the politics, can you see that? I'm going to assume yes, unless you tell me otherwise. So the more I live here, the more I really think a lot about the geography of British Columbia as having a really serious impact on the politics. It's really shaped it and continues to shape it. So if you just look at this map, and note I've said where is the capital of British Columbia. If you note right there on Vancouver Island, right at the tip, there is Victoria. And it is amazing how much influence the fact that the capital is right, really not on the mainland, and really separate from the province, has had on its political history, and I think continues to have it. So really, if you look at this geography, you see that Vancouver, the largest city, is obviously on the mainland, right at the tip, the southern tip of the province. And if you look really carefully at the kind of the top part of that map, and you kind of draw lines, say from where I am, which is Prince George, into Alberta. If you draw a straight line into Alberta, you would hit Edmonton. So you get a better sense there of how more north their capital is. And it takes us about 10 hours to drive up from Vancouver to Prince George. And so you can see that Prince George is really the middle of the province. And it's about from Prince George to Rupert, out there on the coast, it's about another 8 hours. So it's a very large province, and it it's really marked, I think, by its amazing geography. Its politics are marked by that geography. In many ways, sort of bioregionally, it would make a lot more sense if really the province were more east to west, and you kind of connected that northern part of Alberta into the northern part of British Columbia. They have a lot more in common, and certainly as I talk about the political culture, really connecting those two. And if you've been following the news, of course, the Enbridge pipeline is a major issue right now in British Columbia, and so I'll come across there, sort of, north of Prince George and out towards Kitimat, which is, it's not on this map, but it's sort of south of Rupert, and so south and inland of Rupert. So I think if you get a kind of a good sense that the province is marked by this real geographic diversity, and it's pretty critical to understanding, I think, British Columbia. The next slide I want to show you is another map, and I think I've got that at 74, so unless I hear otherwise, it might be a little bit hard to see the names in here, but the reason I put this up is that this is a First Nations map of British Columbia. And again, I think it's very, very critical for us to understand First Nations issues in BC. And the reason for this is that most of the land claims here are unsettled land claims. There are certainly some, there's the famous Douglas treaties of the 1850s. And then there's some more recent treaties of the Nisga'a Treaty, for example. But most of the land claims are unsettled. And to understand, again, particularly contemporary BC politics, you really need to know the number of First Nations bands that are here. And you have to understand as well that it's not a homogeneous group of people, that the First Nations have different land claims themselves, some that cross over other territories of other First Nations. Sometimes there's internal issues between band governments and hereditary chiefs discussing what areas will become treaty lands. And so this is an extremely important political issue in British Columbia, and understanding BC is really thinking more about the geography as well of the First Nations land claims. And you might also have heard that there was a recent Supreme Court decision that dealt with some of the land claims of the Chilcotin, which are just south of Prince George in Williams Lake. So I think understanding the land base really helps to understand BC politics. So I just wanted to sort of give you that little bit of a background. I'll come out of the PowerPoint now, because if it's hard to see, it's probably going to be difficult. So just to give you a little bit of background in a quick overview of the legislature, again in Victoria. So there are 85 seats, and it's really critical to know here that much of the rural and northern areas of BC are very overrepresented in the legislature. And by that I mean that most of the communities, most of the constituencies are underpopulated for the normal distribution that you would have of seat representation. And I want to raise that because one of the things I'm going to talk about briefly in my discussion is sort of the history of a kind of social contract between the southern Victoria capital and the rest of the province for kind of maintaining rural and northern communities, particularly in a resource economy. And so some of that overrepresentation occurs as a result of trying to maintain that. Currently, the Premier of BC is a Liberal, but in British Columbia, Liberal actually means small c Conservative. And so it's very interesting to look at some of the party history out here. And again, in 20 minutes, I'm not going to give you it all, but some of you may be familiar with it. That some of the names of the political parties, for example, out here are unique in the sense that that we haven't seen them represented at the federal level. So just briefly then, the political culture of British Columbia has been called lots of things. It's been called a frontier orientation, individualistic, radical, utopian. Those are certainly representations of the political culture, but probably the best way to sort of quickly give you an overview of the sense of that is, BC didn't enter Confederation until 1871, and it was a predominantly resource-based, again, province. It had its own fur trade, the gold rush of the 1850s, and primarily a resource economy. And if you look again at the geography, you have a very kind of colonial capital, but the rest of the province has a far more individualistic kind of homesteading settler streak, certainly for its early history. And the idea of kind of coming out here and striking it rich and finding gold or finding resource development, and people came out here to work in the resource industry. So it has that sort of long history. And I'm going to jump all the way to the 1950s to kind of set the story for really what's kind of the contemporary discussion. We have to sort of understand what happened in the 1950s, and that was the rise of a party called the Social Credit. You often hear them referred to as the Socreds, and they were fiscal conservatives. And there was an interesting kind of development under W.A.C. Bennett, and he and his government really believed in the creation of large infrastructure projects that would develop the province. And in most of Canada, you can see that during this period of history, there was what we call a province building period, where each province was looking to develop itself in its own way. And I'm sure you've already studied Canadian federalism, so you're going to be very familiar with this idea of the need for provinces to feel a sort of independence and development of their own strengths. But the interesting thing about the Socreds was their interest in the province building project that also ensured that there would be communities throughout British Columbia, even though, again, most of what was going on was resource extraction. There wasn't a lot of secondary manufacturing. What was happening was the logs were being cut down, and what they were doing was ensuring, the province wanted to ensure that logs were cut close to communities, so it would allow for the development of communities, and communities were often developed by companies. So we have lots of company towns that developed British Columbia, and Kitimat, which I'm sure you've again heard about in relation to the pipeline. Kitimat is a planned community. In other words, it was built by sort of a company town. And so we had public policy that aimed at ensuring that there would be the development of lots of communities throughout British Columbia in rural and northern communities. So often, particularly at this university where we study a lot of the story of the resource development, we talk about policies like appurtenancy, which was the policy of the government to say that a company that was logging had to mill that piece of wood close to where they had cut it down. And that ensured that you had mill towns developing all through BC. So this sort of province building created a kind of agreement, we kind of call it a social contract, between these rural and northern communities and the rest of the province, because a lot of the resource wealth was moving out of the north and going down into, obviously into Vancouver and Victoria, into the lower mainland. And so as a result, over a long period of history, you sort of had this kind of agreement about the way that the province would develop. As a result of that, too, you also have development of a strong labor movement here. And so most of what you see in terms of political cleavages of BC really started between labor and government and companies. And so you see that this left-right polarization in BC for a very long time was centered around not whether or not you would extract resources. In fact, it was still based on resource extraction, but the division between labor ensuring that the worker had good working conditions and those companies. And so there was a lot of movement, a lot of work between the companies and labor. And traditionally, your understanding of kind of like the NDP would really be that they also have labor and environmentalists. And in BC, of course, this also occurred during the 1990s. We have the rise of the environmental movement, what became called the War of the Woods, which was, again, that it wasn't an argument for resource extraction for labor and the government. It was that they were wanting to do that, but now environmentalists were involved in saying, this had to stop, particularly clear cutting, which became a huge issue in British Columbia during the 1990s. And so there was a kind of a rise of what's been called post-material values, which is really just a way of saying that people became more concerned about things beyond kind of consumer society and were really worried about the aesthetic value of the environment in British Columbia. So in kind of understanding that, the 2000s, in 2000, when Gordon Campbell, a Liberal, again, small c conservative, fiscal conservative, came into power, you really see a major shift here in the breakdown of the social contract, including kind of the breakdown between the kind of agreements between government and labor. And you see a real development here of the kind of much more open for business, much more oriented toward business. And so the labor movement has had some trouble here in the past while, although, again, public servants a little bit different than in the resource industry, but you'll see a lot of labor, good jobs in the resource industry have declined. So you might have heard about the teacher strike. Again, yes, very strong labor movement there, but a lot of the workers who were in the woods, for example, in the forestry industry, that's declined quite rapidly, and so that's also been impacted by the pine beetle. There's a lot here, so I'm hoping that you're following the story that I'm trying to tell. It's essentially a shift from the social contract between the government and all the communities, and quite a bit of a breakdown of that. And so you're starting to see the rise of deep political cleavages that I think go beyond just a sort of left-right distinction, because you have the labor and environmentalists are not in agreement on the left. And I really want to take you back to the point that I made earlier, that there's a very strong First Nations presence now in both as a legal force and as a social force. And this is really, really, really critical. The political economy of British Columbia has shifted a little bit away from the resource-based to a service-based economy, but much of the northern economy and the things that you're hearing about in the news right now, like Enbridge, they're still strongly based in a resource environment. And therefore, when you see First Nations presence in the political realm very, very strongly, because they have strong legal right to the land, and they're making strong land claims, especially against these unsettled treaties. And so there's a lot of discussion going on now about settling the land base. So I hope that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of this sort of story of BC that's sort of, we all hear it's sort of polarized and it's left-right, but it's very complicated because the political culture is very diverse. You can actually point to a number of distinct political cultures in British Columbia, and that makes it different than some provinces or most provinces in Canada. I just also wanted to raise one other thing in my 20 minutes, and that's a little bit of a discussion about BC's electoral system. And that's because we had a very interesting process going on in the 2000s. In 2003, the government decided to put together what was called a Citizens' Assembly to review the first past the post electoral system. And the Citizens' Assembly was a group of individuals, ordinary citizens, who were brought together and educated on different different voting systems. And they chose, at the end of the day, one called a single transferable vote system. And I'll send along the PowerPoint, and I have some links there if you want to go and have a look at the system. But really what's interesting about this story is that BC often takes things to referendum, and this is a case in which this was brought twice to British Columbians, and the first time it almost passed, and then the second time it failed quite dramatically. And it was a very interesting process for democratic governance, and at first it was really looked at as a very important experiment in democracy. In fact, they tried to replicate it in Ontario, and that was to really ask the question, could a group of citizens get together, be educated in a particular area of in this case, a voting system, and then go to the public and say, you know, as a group of citizens, we think that this is the best one, and we think that this will solve some of the problems that people are concerned about. And it was a very interesting process, I think, primarily because the government probably didn't expect it to work quite as well as it did. And so when the Citizens Assembly accepted this idea in 2005 of accepting a single transferable vote, lots of people thought that it would work and that would be a good idea, and again, kind of a bit of a leap of faith. And so the government really wanted to rerun this because it had been very, very close. And when they did, it was the first time that the government actually got involved in trying to, I guess, to sort of shift the outcome. And instead of just having a public education process, what they did was they gave some money to two camps, the yes side and the no side. And unfortunately, the no side came out much stronger. They were able to convince people, but it was a very interesting experiment in democracy in British Columbia, and it's spoken about an awful lot. So if that's something you haven't really looked into, it was a very interesting process. So at the end of the day, the BC does have this sort of left-right division. It is still, there's quite a dependence on the resource economy, although again in Vancouver, there's certainly been a shift to the service economy, but most of the North still relies on resources for the basis of its economy, and it's a very interesting, even though you can show that there's been a lot of services, most of the services do support resource industry. So I hope that gives you a bit of a background. I don't know what you're interested in talking about. I thought maybe some things that might interest you, again, is a bit of a discussion about Enbridge, or the Supreme Court decision, the land decision, or in fact the unexpected results of 2013, because if any of you were following the election in 2013, you probably heard that the NDP were supposed to win the election, and they didn't. The Liberals, in fact, won a majority, much to many people's surprise. It was supposedly unexpected, but I think that there's a lot of explanations for what happened. So I hope that helps, and you have some questions, and we can chat.
Hi Tracy, thanks for your patience as we unmute over here. Thanks for that overview of BC politics. That's fantastic, and I'll turn it over to students here live in the classroom, and for folks that are tuning in online, we want you to be part of the discussion as well. Feel free to visit provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca. That's provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca, where you'll find an online blog where we're tracking some of the conversation there, not only live here, but after the video is posted on YouTube as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to our students. There's a lot of ground that we can cover. Again, we talk about Enbridge pipeline, which is a big issue here in Alberta. We can talk about the last provincial election, or anything that Tracy touched on that you'd like to hear more about. So by all means, yes.
I'm curious to know if the overlapping land claims by different First Nations bands plays any significant role in delaying the settling of said lead claims to the advantage of other parties?
Yes, it makes it very, very complicated. Obviously, you have First Nations who are making claims about particular areas, and other First Nations saying, "Well, this is also our land." And it's primarily, again, as I'm sure you know this already, but of course it's because the way that they look at land claims is more about where they hunted or traveled, and so some of the discussion comes down to the oral history and reviewing those claims. And again, if you look at the recent Supreme Court decision, it's very interesting because they have a couple of options for the way they could do things. They can either say, well, you were here, or you were here, or you were here, or they could look at a whole area and make the claim for the whole area. And in fact, that's what they did in this decision. So it does make it more complicated. I also want to point out that let me give you another example where it's not always just a land claim that comes into question here. It's also where consultation needs to take place. So you I'm sure know that the Supreme Court said that First Nations need to be consulted in particular resource areas of resource extraction. And so my colleague and I were doing a study of the port at Prince Rupert, and the federal government had been talking to a certain First Nation there and making agreements about whether they could use some of the land and how they were going to go about doing that, and making agreements about jobs and these sorts of things. And then a few months later, another First Nation group came forward and said, but we also have rights in this area. And the First Nation had to talk to the government about which they're sort of saying, well, who do we consult with? So that became, again, a complicated issue of who do you consult with, and even internally it becomes complicated because there are band councils, and there are also hereditary chiefs who sometimes have different ideas about the way that the land should be used. So I think what's really the most critical thing to understand here, and I say this a lot because I hear when people are sort of talking collectively about First Nations sort of for or against resource extraction, to remember that it's not a homogeneous group of people. There are different bands. There are, even within bands, there are people who have very different opinions about the way things should go, and so that's been a very interesting. That's very interesting in terms of of policy and how things are settled. So yes, it does matter.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. A follow-up on that one. I mean, you hear a lot about how First Nations politics is distinct in British Columbia compared to other provinces. What are some of the big ways that you've noticed that First Nations politics would differ from, say, the way that it works in Western Canada and maybe in the East?
Well, probably because of unsettled land claims. I think that it starts earlier. And the important piece to understand here is that as treaty negotiations go on, resource extraction is happening on the land. So some of these treaty processes are taking years and years and years and years and years, but there's still things that are going on that have to be consulted about. And so I describe often the First Nations politics here as really looking at two aspects of it. One is the legal aspect, and that is the rights that were gained out of Section 35, but because land claims aren't settled, a lot of First Nations are looking to make those claims and make them stick, just like happened in the Jacotan case just recently. But the other really important aspect in BC politics is what I call sort of First Nations as a social force, and that is the importance of First Nations in explaining and having non-Aboriginal citizens support their land claims and support their concerns over the environment. So I think that it's different because they play two very, very strong roles in what I'll call governance instead of government. You know, that they're in the policy community. There are lots of actors that come to play, and some of them have very strong legal kind of background and legal force, and others are very strong social forces. They are able to move communities and move people to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should think about this. So I think that that's why BC politics is very different when we look at First Nations inclusion in the decision-making processes.
Good, thanks. Open to other questions? Yeah, Aurora?
You had said that there's an issue with overrepresentation of rural ridings in BC. I'm just wondering how significantly them having a bigger voice affects BC's, kind of political outcomes as a whole.
Yeah. Well, I think that what we see is that really their representation should be less. The BC Electoral Commission actually tried to reduce it, reduce the northern and rural ridings fairly recently, and the government said no. We're gonna go with this very large diversion from what the legislation says, based really on the fact that these are still they're important and strong communities, and they have quite a strong political voice, even though the populations are small. It's a very interesting politics in the north. I know when I first came to British Columbia, I was fairly new to the classroom, and I remember making some grand statement about how most people, when they go to vote, of course, they don't know who their MLA is, and they just really are voting for the party. And that was my probably big city girl view of politics. And I remember the students sort of looking at me here like, but we just had lunch with, the MLA and Tim Hortons down the street, because it has that kind of, they have that kind of connectivity within the northern communities and the rural communities, even though they're very large constituencies. So I think it is important in BC politics that there is, I think it's the one way that the government has tried to maintain that kind of social contract with the northern and rural communities. I think they've done it through representation, because they certainly haven't done it through things like maintaining that policy that I talked about earlier of appurtenancy. I think they've tried to do it another way, and I think it's critical. And you'll see that some of the senior cabinet ministers are certainly from northern and rural ridings. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It's so hard. It's very, sorry, it's difficult to cross this to see your reaction, to see if I'm getting what you're answering. So please feel free to say you're not answering my question.
That was bang on. I think we're going to continue that conversation too on Thursday when Dwayne Bratt's here from Mount Royal talking about Alberta politics, because I stand to be corrected. I think Alberta is actually the most overrepresented legislature in terms of rural versus urban seats.
It's worth having a look at that, actually. We don't do it very often. I don't even think as political scientists we often, really look at how that plays out. But there's some really good scholarship, early scholarship, certainly in BC on this. Norman Ruff has a good paper, so it's worth looking at.
Good. Other questions? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Out of curiosity, to my knowledge, BC was the last province to come up with a treaty formula for Aboriginals. Is this true?
I don't think I know the answer to that question, other than to say that other than to say because it has the most unsettled treaties, I would suggest that it has been working through lots of processes and they're fairly recent. So I guess I would say it that way. I mean, you look at yeah, I mean, it's worth going to have a look at some of the treaties themselves, and they are fairly recent. So, you know, I would suggest to you to go and have a look at you know, NISHKA. It's a fairly landmark treaty process, but so yeah, I would have a look at some of the more recent ones.
With the success of land claim settlements in BC, has that contributed to decreased, or no change in the animosity between First Nations groups and non-First Nations groups due to the fact that there's so much wealth at stake, essentially?
Well, just let me take your first premise. I don't think that there's been a lot of success, and I think that that's one of the issues. The issue is that there's been slow success of some treaty processes. Many are still, you know, working through the process. And again, let me put it this way: if there's animosity, which I'm not entirely sure, again, that I would accept that premise. There's an issue of saying, let's fix this. Let's create land settlement. We have to have land certainty, and that's also because the resource industries themselves, the companies, want to know with whom they need to negotiate. So, and I would also say that we can see a lot of more successful local governments working out agreements with, you know, bands that are close to you know, to be able to connect services and make joint agreements. We've seen quite a bit of that, actually, and that just makes a lot of sense for small rural places that don't have a lot of capacity, both on the First Nation side and on the local government side. So there has been a lot of that. But what I would say in terms of sort of the tension really is about how do we move forward with, you know, with decisions about resource extraction and you know, issues on the land base more quickly. So I think if it's anything, it's about the speed rather than necessarily that people are feeling that they're going to lose out. I think First Nations, some really are asking about jobs. They're asking about the resource rents. They're asking about how it is that if they're going to take huge risk on their land, that they're going to either be compensated or that their people will have jobs. And in some cases, there's not really good answer to that. The pipeline isn't again a really good example of this, because there's not a lot of jobs. Potentially in the original construction there will be, but long term this is not an area where you're really going to see jobs. So you have this tension, and I think it kind of again goes beyond First Nations and non-First Nations. It goes to the very question of those who believe that the risk is just too high, and those who believe that it's worth the risk. So I think it's a lot more about that conflict than necessarily First Nations, non-First Nations. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that the left side of the political spectrum has a strong connection to labor, and that labor has a strong connection to resource extraction. Mm-hmm. Would you say that opposition and support for the pipeline tends to fall along the left-right spectrum in the province, or does it require a closer look than that?
No, I think it requires a closer look than left-right, and that's again what I was trying to sort of raise with the issue of sort of the left itself. I think always has a little bit of difficulty in where do they court, you know, their vote, and you know, if they simply say, well, we don't want a pipeline, for example, then those people who really strongly believe in resource extraction and development, and do so believing that there are safe ways to do these things, and that you can protect the environment. And so I see it as more than just the left and the right. I think it's this deep question about the risk, and particularly in the case of a pipeline, it's about those who think that that it's that the short-term jobs that will be created by the development of the pipeline itself, even at a kind of national level, never mind just Alberta and BC, but at a national level, if this is going to be great for Canadian energy, and that we're going to be able to kind of have almost a nation-building project around this, there are those, again, I think, who look at it more about, is it worth the risk? And I think that goes beyond right and left.
Okay. Other thoughts or questions, Tracy? Tracy, off the top of your discussion, you talked a bit about your time in Quebec and how the polarization that you witnessed there in the mid-1990s, which is hard to find a more polarized political environment than that, differed from the polarization you experienced since you moved to BC. Now, I know that we can talk about how that's a matter of dimensions, left, right, postmodern, modern in BC, and federalist, separatist in Quebec. But are there other differences in that polarization that you've noticed?
Well, I guess I have to say that a lot of it is really connected to my geography. I mean, I don't think that I was as aware when I lived in Quebec even, because of course I was in Quebec City. I was in really the heart of where the discussion was going on at the time, and really the polarization that I saw there was really strictly about whether or not the best way to move forward was for Quebec to be a separate province or state. And it was a very the polarization felt much more around, like, it was more like, can we do this? Maybe we should do this, but can we achieve it? And I sort of felt that that's where it was. And again, I was in Quebec and not in Montreal, and again, not certainly in northern Quebec, because certainly there were great tensions again by First Nations people there who felt very strongly that obviously they did not want a separate Quebec. But when I came out to BC, I think what surprised me about the polarization was that people here were saying to me that, they didn't really think BC politics was very polarized. And that's kind of what shocked me. And particularly, again, as I was living in a northern community, very individualist streak, I saw a little bit of something too that I hadn't seen in Quebec, and that was that there was beginning to be, and I see this even more now, a kind of breakdown as well of the trust of the state. And again, I think that's a little bit a part of living in the northern part of the province, and probably in Alberta you can probably see that too, that kind of the northern part of, again, the province not having the same kind of sense that government, or even, I just mean the state in general as a concept, as an idea. It was a little bit more anti-elite, a little bit more anti-intellectual, certainly generally, I would say more anti-intellectual in British Columbia than in Quebec. So yeah, and it was a very marked difference, I felt, between what I had seen in Quebec, and I felt like I was really being educated here when I first came out. And I'll just be honest with your students, and I didn't know where Prince George was when I first came out. I had to get a map and look it up. I had no sort of sense of even where I was coming to. So for me, I was really being educated in Western politics, and it felt, and it still does feel, quite foreign even from growing up in Ontario.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tracy. We've come full circle, and we appreciate your taking the time to talk to us a bit about what I think is a really new and I think an important perspective that you're shedding on BC politics and providing an internal and regional dimension to it, and talking a bit about how the view of politics is different from the north versus and rural areas versus the cities in the south. And I think that's a theme that we'll find throughout our discussions across Canada. So I want to thank you for sharing your time with us, and again, invite people to join us for the discussion on YouTube in the comments section, and also at provincialpolitics.blogspot.com. So thanks, Tracy.
You're welcome. I'm always around if you want to send an email or something. If you have a question, I can help you out with readings or anything if you want to have a deeper look.
Thanks a lot, Tracy, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.